at Nutanix, we engage across a whole raft of different industry verticals and sectors. Today we're taking a bit of a more of a focus type area around education in particular. It's very topical at the moment. There's a lot of need from an education perspective in order to drive a different thought process. So education is the key focus, but please know that Nutanix works across a whole lot of different industry verticals. So really quickly, I've only got half an hour, and for those who know me, having a time period is more as, too much to say rather than not enough. But anyway, I'll try and keep it to the half hour. So if we think about education, and particularly around the digitalisation of the education sector, some of the things that have, absolutely just completely changed how education works, we'd be remiss not mentioning COVID. If you think about what's happened to education and what they had to do in a very short period of time, they went from being essentially a face-to-face, analog-based learning environment to a digital learning environment almost overnight. They literally had to do massive changes of digitalisation. COVID drove, completely different ways of educating students, completely different ways of engaging. And what's been really interesting is that hasn't stopped. Post-COVID world, there's a lot of scenarios where the education functions now starting to look at how do we do online learning, how do we keep that online learning. We also need to look at what other technology is coming down the line. If you're looking at things like virtual reality, you're looking at things like, rich content, you're looking at, the YouTube generation, the integrating digital capability into classrooms, into those learning capabilities. IT now has to deliver not just content, but also physical devices, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, this is not optional. When you think about some of the rules, I just pulled this off the Victorian government site, basically this is a mandated requirement. Digitalisation of education will be mandated and will be delivered across all the different curriculum. Schools and educational facilities must deal with this situation. So we've got this tsunami of change happening, a tsunami of digitalisation, but at the same time we've got a problem. And that problem is, both at an organisation or an economic level, we just find it next to impossible to get staff. The IT world is devoid of a significant percentage of the staff that they need to have in order to be successful. So even if organisations wanted to go and get more staff, they're just finding it next to impossible to do so. And particularly from an education perspective, it's not like they have huge funds in order to do that. Education budgets are being squeezed. There's always an issue around funding elements. So even if they wanted to get the staff, they just don't have the capacity in order to go and get it. So fundamentally, if you're an IT administrator or an IT manager within an educational function, you've got a problem. You've got all of this extra workload, you've got all this extra capacity that you need to do to drive better learning outcomes for students, but at the same time, you've now got less staff, less capability. You're going to need to do something about that. So you have to change the paradigm. You have to change the way that you think. And we at Nutanix believe that we actually have part of that solution. I'd love to say we've got the silver bullet. I'd love to say we've got all the answers, but we just don't. What we do have, though, is a really good start. What we can do is we can fundamentally change the way that IT functions, IT budgets, and particularly IT resources are allocated. So what we can do is we can change the underpinning infrastructure capability. We can deploy a capability which will fundamentally reduce your CapEx costs, reduce your OpEx costs, reduce your operational effort that needs to be associated with feeding and watering that infrastructure, and allow you to then redeploy those resources to more value-added functions. Nobody stands in front of a principal or stands in front of a school board and says, I just patched 42 servers this week. Aren't I fantastic? What they want you to be doing is standing in front of them and saying, I worked with an educator in order to drive a better learning management outcome for a student. That's where we should be spending more time from an IT function perspective. So, big statements. How do we do it from a Nutanix perspective? Well, let's think about what currently works in the world of infrastructure and applications deployment at the moment. What actually drives value is those applications. It's about how we engage with the students, how we engage with the teaching body, how we engage with the parents, how do we engage with all of those other stakeholders that exist within an educational function. Ultimately, it's the applications that make a difference. At the moment, though, what we do is we look at each one of those applications as an independent element. Every time a teacher comes and says, I want a new application, what happens is the IT team gets in a room, grabs a whiteboard, draws it all up. How am I going to store the data? How am I going to put the network together? How am I going to architect this thing? They work out a decision and they go and actually acquire the application and deploy it. What you're actually doing is making up to a 5 to 8 year investment. You're making a 5 to 8 year infrastructure architecture decision at that point, because that application is tied to the way that it's going to be delivered. Even if it's off a public cloud, could be off your own private infrastructure, could be off a third party's environment, but you're still making a long-term architecture decision based upon that application. And what we have shown, particularly with COVID and all the other things that are coming down, that those architecture decisions rarely are fast enough and can be agile enough to meet the changing needs of the education system. That those applications will move far faster than what the underpinning infrastructure can. So that means that IT managers are now faced with a difficult situation. They're going back to their business managers, they're going back to their CFOs and saying, please sir, can I have some more? They've got it wrong. They've either put too much infrastructure on the ground, they haven't put enough, they haven't got it right. So fundamentally at Nutanix, we like to think that there's a different way of looking at it. What we do essentially is we create an abstraction layer between all those different ways of hosting infrastructure and the applications that run on top of it. So essentially we can take all that smarts in the cloud, we can bring all of that out of hardware, all of that out of infrastructure and lift it up into a software layer that gives you a lot of flexibility and capability. So for those of you who know Nutanix, essentially this is about the hyperconverged infrastructure. This is about taking all of those smarts from your SAN layer, from your network layer, from your compute layer, bringing it up to a software capability and allowing you to run commodity hardware that sits underneath. Now that commodity hardware could be a HPE server, it could be a Dell server, it could be an Lenovo server in your own private data center, it could be an AWS bare metal server sitting off in a public cloud, or it could be a specific edge-based device that is required to be deployed to a remote educational facility or to a distance learning or some sort of other operational technology or IoT-based sort of environment. So fundamentally, we don't care anymore what that underpinning infrastructure looks like. You can now move those applications across that infrastructure as you need to, with all the smarts now sitting at that layer that sits across the top. And as you can see there, all of those elements, whether that's capacity planning and management, whether that's performance management, whether that's all your hardware control, all of those elements now become standardized across all those different ways of deploying that infrastructure and capability. Essentially, it gives you a true edge-to-cloud management and infrastructure layer that sits across all those bits. So when you think about it at the moment, if I'm an IT manager at a school and I'm running a typical 3-tier infrastructure, I've got to worry about managing my servers through a particular interface, normally from the vendor, whether that's HP, Dell, etc. I've then got to manage my switching environment, so there's a different set of interface, different set of educational capabilities. I've then got to manage my storage, another set of, and as those change, if they run on a cloud, I've now got to do all that again. It's really complex, it's really difficult. So if I think a little bit about, just security, if I think a little bit about that HCI layer, what Nutanix has done is taken it from that basic sort of infrastructure that we're known for and turned it into a whole lot more capability that sits across all those elements. So if I just pick for an example around that security, I know it's very topical on the education function, when you think about the nightmare that IT administrators have within education, when you think about their core customers being the students, how big an attack vector that really is. How many students want to get in there and hack away and muck around with their infrastructure and do stuff that they shouldn't be doing, not because necessarily they're malice, just because they can and because they're kids and they don't understand anything different. So, it's a really big problem. It's also really important data. Student data, it's got to be protected, it's legislated, it's mandated, there's a whole lot of rules that you've got to maintain. So security is a really big problem for particularly the educational sector. What we also know is that security is not well done as an industry, both within the educational sector and as across the board. In fact, if we looked at a couple of stats, if you think about how much is actually spent on security, and this is a Gartner stat, that in this year, basically, that it's due to go up to about $5 billion spent on security. So this is about deploying new capabilities, this is deploying, firewalls and antivirus and all that sort of stuff, and it's really chasing that 0-day, making sure you're updated, make sure you've got the best of breed capability. The really scary stat though is that 99% of all breaches in anything to do with corporate environments are actually done through vulnerabilities that are at least 6 months old. So basically when people are breaking in, they're not doing 0-day threats, they're actually getting in through vulnerabilities that we already know about, we already know what it looks like, we've already got patches for, we already know how to solve the problem. But the IT administrators, the people who manage their environments, haven't actually deployed them out and left organisations vulnerable and schools vulnerable to attack. Now, why is that the case? Because it's not like realistically, that there's a whole lot of IT administrators out there going, I don't need to worry about patching, I don't need to worry about updating, I don't need to worry about doing that. Fundamentally, everybody knows that they need to do this, but they're not doing it. Why is that? And look, from everything that we've seen across the industry sector, it really comes down to three key areas. The first is complexity. As I was talking about before, when you've got all those different environments, all those different capabilities, you've got to look at each of the different patch levels, each of the different BIOS updates, you've got to understand how they all integrate with each other, you've got to run the test environment, then you've got to try and, find a spot to do it and deploy it. Then you've got to think about how you're going to do it on the cloud, how you're going to do it on the IoT systems. It's really complex and it's really difficult to do. And so with that, so much complexity, it just becomes hard. And when things become hard, people tend to deprioritize it. It's human nature. You'll pick the easy stuff rather than do the hard stuff. And that then goes directly to the second one, which is about lack of resources. When you've got 46 people picking up the phone, calling in, my student laptop's broken, I can't get access to this, the AV's broken, the IT teams tend to do a bit of everything. When you think about that and all those urgent issues that you've got to deal with, the non-urgent but important, which is typically around your security environment, simply gets deprioritised. It gets put to, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it next week, I'll do it next month. Next thing you know, you're 3 months behind. And then you've got vulnerabilities with your environment. And the last thing is human error. Humans are really bad at doing exactly the same thing every single time, multiple times. We're just bad at it. You get things wrong. You forget to do something. You do 99 out of 100 servers. It's just human error just comes into play when you're doing really repetitive tasks. We're just very poor at that sort of environment. So you couple those things together. You've got a really complex environment. You just don't have enough people to do what you need to do, and then you make your mistakes doing it. That's where we got vulnerabilities. That's where it happens. So if I think about from a Nutanix perspective, what do we bring that's different to that? Well, quite simply, what we do is we drive a very different way of looking at your environment. So as I said before, when you've got that common layer that sits across all of those different environments, all those different infrastructures, all those different capabilities, what you're able to do then is drive a single platform across all of it. As I said, you've got one interface, you've got one capability, you've got one set of solutions. But really importantly now, you're now lifting it up from infrastructure into a platform. So all of that effort associated with looking at the different BIOS levels, making sure it's all tested, making sure it's all connected together, all of those interactivities, all those capabilities are all done and dealt with by the Nutanix platform. You don't need to worry about that anymore. You literally pick your version, pick your platform, deploy it out there, thank you very much. So it now drives a real simplicity of platform across the environment. When you think about it, you just don't have to do as much stuff anymore. You use the system, you use the capability, you use all of those inbuilt tools and elements that says you just don't need as much resources to feed and water your infrastructure. So, whether that's, physically deploying the patches, whether that's looking at things like your backup and resiliency, whether it's looking at your hardening guides and managing that, all of those elements simply become less work, so therefore less physical resources needed to do it, frees resources up to do other things that you don't need to do. And the last one's pretty simple, but human error is mainly solved through automation. So when you've got that common platform that sits across all of those different elements, you're able to deploy it in exactly the same way, exactly the same time, and have 100% confidence that it's done across all of those different elements. So we have things like we call a lifecycle manager, or LCM for short. Great marketing sort of term, but so basically what that does is it does one-click deployments. So you will say, upgrade my environment to the latest patch version, and it is literally a click of the button. And the system will automatically take it, download all of the patches, all of the BIOS updates, everything you need to do from a security perspective, knowing they're fully tested. It will then deploy it on each of the elements that sit underneath that capability. We'll roll them through, take them out of production, update them, put them back into production, do all of its post-implementation tests, work its way through, get 100% hit rate, finish off the task, send you a message that it's done. We actually had somebody who actually updated their entire 40-node cluster from a helicopter over the Grand Canyon. He was literally flying over that Grand Canyon, hit update, and then 40 minutes later, in production, during the day, all of his systems updated, no problems. And he likes to skite about that on a regular basis. So that is now capable when you've got that capability. So let's have a look at a bit of a practical example of what this means from that perspective. So if you think about things like hardening guides, so this is things like outside of education, something like a PCI requirement, maybe it's a HIPAA requirement from a healthcare, maybe it's something like an Essential 8 from a government regulation perspective. Lots and lots, about 42 different hardening guides that we have up on our platform that need to maybe be deployed across an environment. So in the current world, in the current, multi-tier, different vendors, different capabilities, essentially what IT, functions need to do, they need to look at those hardening guides, they need to download them, they need to understand what it means, they need to then go, how am I going to apply it? I work for another organisation whose hardening guide to meet various government standards was about 142 pages thick. Of all the configuration changes that you needed to make to your environment in order to meet those government standards. You then got to apply all those changes. And back to what I said before, humans are bad at doing this, it's difficult, it's hard, it takes a long time, it's very complex. But really importantly, it's not what you've done, it's what you've proved you got it done. So when you get audited, when you've got all those capabilities coming in, you've got to prove that you did it. So then you've got to create a baseline, you've got to produce all that documentation, it's got to be human readable, ready to go. And that's only for day one. Then you've got to manage for day two. So what happens when you get drift? You've got to check to adherence every time there's a change, you've got to see what's happened, you've got to look at that manually, and then you've got to make the changes to it so that you've got to keep it in alignment, because there's no point being, compliant on day one if you're not compliant on day 10, if you're not compliant on day 100. And all of that process happens again and again and again as you roll through the systems, as things update, as things change. And really importantly, you do it on your private environment, you've got to do it again on your public cloud, or you've got to do it again on your IoT environment, or you've got to do it, and this becomes really, really complicated, takes an enormous amount of resources in order to get the job done. So if I think it from a Nutanix perspective, we work at things in a very different way. So fundamentally, ultimately we deploy a Nutanix capability that sits in the middle of all of that. What we have is, as I said, about 42 different hardening guides that are automatically up on the system that you can download, and then you can run what does this mean to my environment? It'll do all of the updates, all of the things it needs to do, and basically tell you everything that it's going to change before you do it. You hit apply. It's a one-click button, hit apply. It will then make all the changes and give you a human readable document at the other end that says, here's all the changes I made, and here's how now I meet all those requirements that exist within the hardening guide. It will then sit there and you can turn on basically drift management. So it will constantly check adherence to that guide. It will see any variances from that. So an IT administrator may have changed a particular security element or done something to the environment. It will then notify you of that. If you want automatic compliance, you can do so. If you want to do it based on, I want to know what's happening, and then apply those manuals, but it will then manage all that drift for you. And if those hardening guides change, we'll download the new hardening guide and then go back through the process. It happens for you fully automatically and becomes literally a single click of a button in order to deploy out that security hardening guide across that entire environment. And really importantly, you only have to do it once, because it will apply it on every single one of your environments that you operate on, from the public cloud all the way to the edge. So when you think about that from a difference perspective of, you've got all of those different environments, all those different elements, all those different human tasks that need to be done, how much effort is associated managing all of that, as opposed to literally checkbox, hit apply, job done. And look, I'll happily show you and take you through it in a little bit of demo at our booth that we've got sitting there later on. But that's a real story. That's exactly what we're able to do. That's exactly what we're able to demonstrate out there from a Nutanix capability. And that is just but one example of all of those different elements that sit in underneath all of those different characteristics. That I just went through security in a really quick, overview, but that is but one element. We can start to talk about things like capacity planning and give you a full runway of all of the capacity that exists in your environment, what is happening that on a day-to-day perspective. We can give you literally a report that sits in your inbox every Monday morning that says, based on your current usage, you will run out of capacity in X number of days. So you now know that you have how many days in front of you before you run out. And particularly at the moment, with some of the challenges that we've got of getting hardware delivered, you can now start to put into how long your delivery times is and when do you need to start to place reorders. In fact, we've actually got organisations who will take that capacity report, will automatically, through our open APIs, deploy it straight into their ServiceNow platform. It will generate an approval process. It will generate a bill of materials that they need based on their standard nodes that they order. They'll get approved, and that order will go directly to the supplier to provide the infrastructure to turn up on site. And the first time anybody sees it is when the node appears on site. They plug it in, they literally hit extend, and you've got the new infrastructure sitting in the environment. So capacity planning becomes just as simple as security. It becomes just as simple as, and I could go through, a whole raft of different elements, whether it's performance, whether it's, malware protection, whether it's et cetera, it's all built in and baked into the environment. So look, I've gone through that very, very quickly. I only had sort of 20, 25 minutes to have a bit of a conversation with you. Look, I appreciate your time. Hopefully we've given you just a small slither of an insight and a little bit of a what-if thought process that may sit in your mind about things that we can do differently when you think about that paradigm. But when you fundamentally think about the challenges that education have, that a lot of industries have, you've got a digitalisation program that's being absolutely driven down on top of you if you're an IT administrator or an IT manager in that place. You have to deal with this. It's legislated. It is simply the way of the future. You've got fewer and fewer resources. You've got less and less budget in order to manage that process. You have to think about the world differently in order to be successful. This is, in our opinion, a significant change of thought that will fundamentally set you up to be successful to meet all of those changes as you roll into the next few years and into the next lot of decades. So we're over at the booth. If you want to know more, if you want to get some more information, come and have a chat. We'll take you through some of the architecture and capability. And look, have a great rest of the BESTech Summit and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.